Like I was saying, today's all about the urinary system. And a key word that at first sounds maybe a little bit intimidating, osmoregulation. That just means what? Regulating the water and also the salt balance in your body. That's one of the kidney's main jobs. Regulate how much water, how much salt you have in your body. If you drink too much water, what's going to happen with your urine? You're going to urinate more, and it's going to be really dilute, right? It's going to be real clear. If you don't drink enough, your body's going to try to keep your water in, so your urine's going to get really almost kind of thick and concentrated, and it's going to get dark. Okay? That's osmoregulation. Now, if we look, first of all, at just the basic anatomy of the urinary system. You have two kidneys. They're in your upper part of your back. Just pay attention, please. In boxing, it's illegal to hit somebody back here, right? Because you can damage your kidneys. They're not far underneath your back there. I took a lick playing basketball one time. Guy elbowed me right in the kidney, and I urinated blood for 2 or 3 days. I mean, bad, okay? Really bad stuff. But those are your two kidneys. They're connected up to this tube right here. Long, skinny tube. That tube carries the urine from the kidney down to the bladder. That tube is called a ureter. Now, there's two words that are really similar. Don't confuse them. The ureter carries the urine from the kidney to the bladder. Here's the bladder. The bladder, though, the way out is another little tube. And the tube on the way out is called the urethra. So you got the ureters carry urine from the kidney to the bladder, and the urethra carries it out. Another couple things I'll point out while we're looking at this picture. Our next system after this one is the circulatory system, the heart, and stuff like that. This big blood vessel, big artery, runs from your heart all the way down your body like a main artery. It's a main highway almost. What's the name of that biggest artery in your body? All your arteries branch off of it pretty much. What's the name of the most important artery in your body? You guys should know this. It's called the aorta. If that thing pops, which it does sometimes in people, it's called an aneurysm, an aortic aneurysm, you bleed to death really, really fast. But the reason I point that artery out is notice that you got one branch off that artery in red go into each kidney. Those two branches, and we're talking about this little red branch right here going to this kidney, and this red branch right here going to that kidney. Those are called the renal arteries. If you were in class yesterday, I pointed out that word. Anytime you see renal, you ought to be thinking what? Kidneys. Okay, so those are arteries that go to the kidneys. The kidney's main job is to filter the blood, right? So that's the blood that it's filtered. The blood that's going through those renal arteries is going to the kidneys to be filtered. Renal arteries, filtering the blood. How'd y'all join us? How'd y'all get in? Yeah. All right, another vessel that I want to point out is this blue one. Okay. Now, almost always, if a vessel is in blue, what does that tell you? It tells you it's what kind of vessel. Arteries in red, veins in blue. Okay. Arteries carry blood how? Which direction? Away from the heart. And veins are always carrying blood to the heart. So like if this was 565, this would be like east and west. Okay? Same highway, different lanes, okay, different directions. Arteries are away from the heart, and usually what kind of blood is moving away from the heart? Oxygenated. There's an exception that we'll get to later, but most oxygenated blood moving away from the heart. And most of the time, what's going back to the heart? Deoxygenated. That's why it's blue. All right, so again, if you see the word renal, you need to be thinking kidney. Renal arteries carry blood to the kidneys so it can get filtered. One other thing I'll mention on this picture, you have two little sphincters down here attached to the bladder and the urethra. What's a sphincter?
A what?
A sphincter. What's a sphincter? It's like a little circle of muscles that you can open and close. It's like a valve almost. One of those sphincters is voluntary, which allows you to do what? Hold it. Hold it. One of them is involuntary. So you got two sphincters, a voluntary and an involuntary one, that help to control when you urinate and when you don't. All right, a couple of key things here about the urinary system. Like it says here, it keeps the chemicals and water in balance by removing a type of waste called urea from your blood. Now, that word urea sounds an awful lot like urine, so that'll be easy to remember. But I want to talk to you about something first. When you eat sugar and glucose, and the glucose goes through glycolysis, in glycolysis, what happens to the sugar? It gets what? Split in half, right? Okay, that's what glycolysis means, split the sugar. And what are the two halves called after glycolysis? Two halves of a sugar after glycolysis, what are they called? There you go. Yeah, your pyruvates, right? Pyruvic acid. You all heard that word, pyruvic acid. After glycolysis, and before the next step, and by the way, what is the next step after glycolysis? Krebs cycle. In between is that preparatory step, right? Pyruvates are 3 carbons. One of the carbons gets taken off in that Krebs step, right? It gets oxidized off. And you have a 2-carbon thing called an acetyl group. And that's what goes into the Krebs cycle and gets broken down. When you eat proteins, things work a little bit differently. You don't have a sugar to split in half. You have a protein, you have a bunch of amino acids you have to break up. So I want to go to I'll come back to this slide, but I want to look at a picture here. You guys ought to know what an amino acid looks like. If you don't, you need to learn. My board is off terribly here, so this is not going to be pretty. That's a hydrogen up top. Well, that's terrible. Anyway, you've got a carbon in the middle, attached to an NH2 group over here, attached to a COOH group over here, and a hydrogen up here. And this part down at the bottom is the R group. Everything except the R group is the same in all the amino acids. How many amino acids are there? 20. Those 20 make up every what? Those 20 amino acids make up every what? Every protein. The bond between those amino acids is referred to as what kind of bond? Peptide bond. Peptide bond. But when you break down amino acids, when you eat protein, by the way, what's the biggest source of protein in your body? In your diet? Meat, okay? When you eat meat, or even beans, peanut butter, things with a lot of protein. Means you got a lot of these amino acids floating around in your body, right? You need to get energy out of them. You need to digest them. But to be able to go into cell respiration, Krebs cycle, you need a 2-carbon group. Well, notice that right here, there's a 2-carbon group. That's pretty much an acetyl group. So what your body does is it has to tear this off right here. It has to tear off this NH2 group. When it tears off that NH2 group, that NH2 group now has an empty bond site right there. What do you think attaches up to it? What's the most abundant atom in your body? What's the most abundant element in the world, in all of the universe? Nope. Most abundant element in the universe. The sun is made almost completely of it. Hydrogen, okay? Really, really common. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. It attaches up to it. What is that molecule right there? N connected to 3 hydrogens. That's ammonia, okay? Ammonia. When you eat proteins, your body generates ammonia. Now, that's the same stuff that's like the main ingredient in Windex, blue window cleaner. Do you want a lot of that stuff in your body? It's toxic. It'll kill you. Okay? But every time you eat meat, every time you eat beans, every time you eat peanut butter, your body's generating some of that ammonia. So it's called a nitrogenous waste because it's nitrogen containing, right? You need to get rid of it. Now, things like fish, pretty much whenever they eat, they generate ammonia, and what do they do right after they generate it? They pee it out, okay? Because they're in the water. Freshwater fish are urinating all the time. And that's not a problem. Why is it not a problem for freshwater fish to just urinate all the time? Because they're in the fresh water, and there's no worry of what? Dehydrating, desiccating. That's not a problem. So freshwater fish make ammonia and just flush it out with lots of water. No problem. Can we do that? Because if we did that, what would happen to us? We'd dehydrate. So that's where another important organ in your body that most people don't know anything about comes into play. Which organ in your body is in charge of getting rid of toxins and waste? The kidney, sort of, but that's not where I'm going with this. What's the other one? The liver. Okay? In a mammal, our liver takes this ammonia and does a little fancy chemistry on it. And it converts the ammonia into a similar chemical, but less toxic, called urea. So when we talk about urea, we're talking about something that used to be ammonia, and it was converted into urea by the liver. It's still toxic, but it's not nearly as toxic as ammonia, which means we can do what with it? We can hold on to it for a little bit longer. We can keep it in our body and wait until we have to wait. Wait until we have to urinate. It won't kill us immediately. So, but eventually, we got to urinate that out. This stuff is soluble in water, so we do have to flush it out with water, and that can be an issue. Now, both of these are toxic. Let's think about things that develop in a hard-shelled egg, like birds and reptiles. It's by the way, does a baby, when it's in an egg, create these two things? Yeah, because it's eating still, right? I mean, it's breaking down the yolk, or what's the protein source in an egg? The albumin, right? So it's digesting those things. It's generating this stuff, okay, in a hard-shelled egg. If it created these two things and didn't have a way to convert them to something else, what would it do to itself? Inside that egg, it would poison itself, right? So things in a hard-shelled egg have another way of dealing with nitrogenous waste. Their liver converts ammonia to something other than urea. Their liver converts it to something called uric acid. So that's supposed to be URIC acid. And the thing about uric acid is that it's solid. It's insoluble in water. It precipitates out. Which part of the egg stores waste? Allantoids, right? But the cool thing about this uric acid is that it's a solid. And that solid, if it's a solid, do we have to worry about it poisoning the baby if it won't precipitate in the water? If it won't dissolve in the water? Nope, it just precipitates out, gets pushed over to the side, baby's okay. Now, we don't have to do this because we don't develop in an egg. What happens when you're in your mother's womb and you create urea? What happens to that urea that you're creating inside a placental mammal? What happens to it? Like when Jacob back there was inside his mother and he created urea, what happened to the urea that Jacob created? It diffused through the placenta from his blood into his mother's blood, and then her kidneys took care of it, right? That's the way it works in placental mammals. But birds, reptiles, they can't do that because they're not connected to their mama anymore. They're in an egg. And if they don't convert ammonia or urea to something different, something insoluble in that body fluids, inside the egg fluids, they'll poison themselves. So that's what uric acid is about. Birds and reptiles create uric acid. And it's a nitrogenous waste in what form? solid. That white stuff that you see birds drop all over you all the time, and you say the bird pooped on you, it pooped on you. What did it do? Pee on you. That white pasty stuff is bird urine. Okay. I don't know. I don't know what actually makes it white. But there's another good advantage of that for birds. Their urine is kind of dry and pasty. What's another advantage other than the fact that it's not as toxic? They don't lose much water when they urinate, right? They don't have to drink as much. Think about how often you see birds drinking water. Not all that often, right? Okay? Because every time they urinate, they don't lose too much water because their urine is coming out pasty. When we urinate, we lose a lot of water. Our urine is mostly water. Even if we're dehydrated, when we urinate, we lose water because we have to flush this stuff out, urea, with a lot of water because it's toxic. It's more colored. Yeah, that white stuff is mostly uric acid. All right, let's go back to this slide for just a minute. So these nitrogenous wastes, ammonia, urea, uric acid, are generated when your body is trying to digest proteins. So proteins get broken down into amino acids, and then amino acids give off the ammonia or urea or uric acid. Any kind of thing with a lot of protein, meat, poultry, chicken, some vegetables, all those things have a lot of amino acids, a lot of protein. Remember that in us, in placental mammals, the ammonia is converted to urea by the liver. And the reason our liver does that is ammonia is really toxic, and we need to convert it into something that's not quite as bad, so we can hold into us a little longer so we don't have to urinate all the time. But the main function of the urinary system, osmoregulation, regulating water and salt balance in your body. That's huge. Another thing that a lot of people don't know about the urinary system is that the kidneys produce this chemical called erythropoietin. Where in this class have we seen that root urethro before? You guys might remember this. Urethro. Let's try to spell this stuff. Erythrocyte. What's a erythrocyte? It's a red blood cell. What's a white blood cell? Leukocyte. What's a platelet? What word means clot? What root means clot? Clot. That's what platelets do. Is clot your word? Thrombo or thrombocytes. So you got and we'll get to that in our next. That's our next topic: the blood and the heart. But this chemical produced by the kidneys, erythropoietin, causes your bone marrow to make more red blood cells. They can make this chemical now synthetically in the lab. And some of these bicycle guys, for example, Lance Armstrong, has been accused of taking this. Why would you want to take this if you were a bicycle rider? You would get more red blood cells, which would mean you could carry more oxygen, which means you could do what longer? What kind of cell respiration? Aerobic. And therefore you wouldn't have to switch over and do anaerobic. You get tired, you get lactic acid, and all that kind of stuff. So marathon guys, if they get a chance, sometimes will cheat with this. Bicycle riders. Why would we make it in the first place? Why would scientists make that chemical in the first place? Most of the time it's for cancer patients. Because when you're on radiation, what happens to your blood cell count? It drops. So they give this to people who are on like radiation or chemotherapy to bring their red blood cell count back up where it needs to go. But the kidneys normally make that for you. Important chemical. All right, this is the stuff we just talked about. Your urinary system has 2 kidneys up in your upper back, 2 ureters, Those are the tubes that carry the urine from the kidney to the bladder. Your bladder is kind of hollow, very stretchy. Attached to the bladder are these two sphincters, these little circular doorways, basically, that can open and close. And those eventually lead to the urethra, which is the tube that carries the urine out. So just basic anatomy of the urinary system there. But now we're going to kind of get into some of the nuts and bolts. Before we do, some facts about urine. What you always wanted to know about urine. A normal adult passes about 4 1/2 of urine each day. But that's not exact, because it depends on what you eat and what you drink. If you drink a lot of water, you're going to use the bathroom more than that. If you don't drink a whole lot of water, or if you eat a lot of salty food, let's put those up right now. Let's do urinary right now. But regardless, it's dependent on your diet and your exercise level, the amount you're sweating, all that stuff matters here. You make less urine at night than you do in the day. Obviously, otherwise you have to get up at night a lot. Normal urine is sterile. No germs in it. I mean, no bacteria, no viruses, no fungi. That's why people like Bear Grylls, if you watch Man vs. Wild, he gets by with drinking it on almost every episode, right? Yeah. But it does have waste in it. But if you're dying in the desert and you don't have any body fluids, you don't have any water, you got to do what you got to do. I think he just enjoys it, though, because he does it every episode of that show. All right, this picture right here is the key to doing well on the test on the excretory system when we get to it. This picture is a picture of something called the nephron. Your kidneys have about 1 million of these little things inside them. These are the filters. These are the parts of your body, parts of your kidneys that filter the blood. They're called the functional unit of the kidney. Meaning they're the parts of the kidneys that get the job done. They're the functional units of the kidneys, nephrons. Like I said, you got about 1 million of them in each kidney. They're filters. So let's look at what's going on here. This is an arteriole, which is just a small what? Your blood vessels go from arteries, and they branch out into smaller vessels called arterioles. And those branch into even smaller vessels called capillaries. Capillaries where all the good stuff happens. Things come in and out of the blood. Then the capillaries start to merge back together. And they merge back together to form venules. And then venules merge together to form veins. And again, we're about to get to the circulatory system. We'll get into how all that works.
Capillaries, arterioles, venules,
okay. Artery, it's a circle, it's a loop. So it doesn't matter where you start in that loop. It's just a circle. They're all connected in a circle. But artery, arteriole, capillary, venule, vein. It's just a loop, connected loop. It's like a set of highways that split and then merge. Okay? Split and merge, but it's still a loop. Anyway, we've got blood coming from that renal artery. It's going into this nephron. So this is an arteriole. And what do we say arterioles branch into? Capillaries. You can't see it very good because it's inside this little yellow funnel-like structure, but there's what's called a capillary bed in there. That arteriole branched into a bunch of little capillaries. That capillary bed is something really important here. It's called the glomerulus. The capillary bed is the glomerulus. It's a bed of capillaries in the nephron. Capillaries are really thin. The walls of the blood vessels are 1 cell thick. Just 1 cell thick at the top. That's thin, right? 1 cell thick. Which means they're very what? Fragile, but also very leaky. Okay? Which means when the blood goes into that glomerulus, what happens? A lot of stuff leaks out. What do we call it when we push something into something and some things leak out and some things don't? Filtration. Okay? Filtering. Okay? So the filtration part of the kidney happens at that little capillary bed called the glomerulus. Most things in the blood get pushed out. The cells themselves don't, like the red blood cells, the white blood cells. Those things stay in the blood vessels. But a lot of the water, salts, wastes, vitamins, even proteins and amino acids, those things get pushed out of the blood vessels and into this big funnel-like structure. This big funnel-like structure is called the Bowman's capsule. Or you might also see it called the glomerular capsule, because it's around the glomerulus, the capillary bed. But it's basically just a big funnel. Its job is to do what? Catch the stuff that got what? Got filtered out of the blood. That's its job. Catch the stuff that got filtered out. Then that leads into this yellow tube. The first part of this yellow tube, called the renal tubule, the first part of it is called the proximal tubule, or sometimes it's called the proximal convoluted tubule. Now let's think about those two words, because they're sort of self-explanatory if you think about it. What's proximal mean? Like if you talk about in the same proximity, what are you saying? They're close to each other. Okay? Proximal means it's close to the glomerulus. It's close to the glomerulus. And if we said that something's convoluted, anybody ever driven up to Paint Rock Valley? Ever driven up there? Past the road is like this. You go for 30 minutes. It's just back and forth, curvy. Convoluted means curvy. Okay, really curvy. So the proximal convoluted tubule, the tube, the part of the renal tubule near the glomerulus, it's really curvy. Let's start with this. The blood got filtered first. It got filtered here at the glomerulus. The blood keeps on going. It goes through these blood vessels, what's left of the blood. But the stuff that got filtered out is called the filtrate. Probably use that word in chemistry, filtrate. Whenever you filter something, the stuff that comes through the filter is the filtrate. Stuff that came through the bottom of the filter. So the filtrate goes through this tube, proximal convoluted tubule. Most of the stuff that got filtered out of the blood, like the water, the vitamins, the proteins, do you want to urinate those out? No, you probably want to keep those. So you need to put those back where? Back into the blood. But the stuff like urea, extra salt, you want to do what with that? You want to get rid of that, okay? So what's got to happen in this proximal convoluted tubule, and also in this little loop right here called the loop of Henle, in these two structures is when we get the second part of urine formation, and it's called reabsorption. So we got filtration, step number 1, filtration, that happens at the glomerulus. Step number 2 happens in the proximal convoluted tubule and the loop of Henle. That's called reabsorption. We're going to reabsorb things like water, amino acids, sugars, things that we want to keep. We're going to absorb those from the tubule back to where? We want to go from the tube back to the blood. Now the water works pretty easy. How do you think the water could move out of that tube? How does water normally move? Osmosis. Okay? The water, most of the water moves from low solute to high solute, right? Because what's the blood going to be like if most of the water just got filtered out of it? It's going to be high solute. That's going to be really thick. So most of the water moves out of this tube and goes back into the blood vessels. Most of it, not all of it. But the other things like the sugars, the proteins, amino acids, vitamins, those things, they have to get pumped from the tube back into the blood. And when we use that word pumped, what are we implying? It uses energy. And what's the process called when we pump things using energy against the gradient? Active transport. So things like sugars and amino acids, those things get actively transported from the tube back into the bloodstream. What are the proteins called that do active transport? What are the little protein pumps? What's the word for them? Carrier proteins. Okay? Carrier proteins. So we have these little carrier proteins inside this tube whose job it is to grab things that your body needs and pump them from the proximal convoluted tubule back into the blood. All right, so far 2 processes have happened. The blood got filtered. A lot of stuff got filtered out of the blood that we want to keep, along with the stuff that we want to urinate out. That's step number 1, filtration. That happens at the glomerulus. Step number 2 is when we try to get back into the blood the stuff that we want to keep. That's called reabsorption. That happens at the first part of the tubule here, the proximal convoluted tubule. Most of the water moves back into the blood by osmosis. Other things like glucose and amino acids, they get pumped, actively transported from the proximal tubule back into the blood. And then we get over here to the last part of the tube. And it's called the distal convoluted tubule. Because it's where? Distal means it's far away from the glomerulus. Over there we get the last step 3 of urine formation. Step 3 is called secretion, tubular secretion. Tubular secretion, that's step number 3 in the process of making urine. Sometimes, let's say you're like me and you drink too much Coke. What do you have too much of in your blood if you're drinking too much Coke? Well, too much sugar, probably too much caffeine, but that's not where I'm going. What else would you have too much of? Yeah, too much acid. Okay? And whenever you hear acid, it's what ion should you be thinking about? H plus, right? H plus makes things acidic. You got too much of that. Okay? So sometimes if your blood is getting a little bit acidic, we know that's a problem, right? So sometimes in this last part of the tube over here, these blood vessels that are around this distal tubule will pump out things like H plus from the blood into the tube. Okay? That's called tubular secretion, where certain waste products like H plus get pumped from the blood into that distal convoluted tubule. It's another way of filtering. Waste like H plus get pumped from the blood vessels into the distal convoluted tubule. So we've got 3 processes involved in making urine. Filtration is step 1. Where does that happen?
In the glomerulus.
The glomerulus, which is a bed of what? Capillaries. Step 2, reabsorption. Taking back in things that you don't want to urinate out. And that happens in the proximal convoluted tubule mostly. Also some in this big loop of Henle. And that's when things move from inside the tube back into the bloodstream. Good things you need to keep. And then over here in step 3, in this distal convoluted tubule, is where we get step number 3, which is tubular secretion. And that's when certain wastes, like H plus, get pumped from the blood into that tube. When we get to the end of the tube, what do we got? And what's inside the tube? Now, after tubular secretion, what do we call the stuff inside the tube? Urine. Okay? Urine. That urine will go through a system of tubes called collecting ducts. Remember, there's like 1 million of these in each kidney. So these collecting ducts eventually all merge together. And they end up emptying into this structure right here. So all these glomeruli are all through here, and these nephrons, and they're dumping into this thing. Which, if these blood vessels weren't here, would look like sort of like your hip joint, right? Think about it. It looks sort of like your hip joint. So sometimes it's called, this area, the renal, you may not be able to read that word, pelvis. It's called the renal pelvis because it sort of looks like your pelvis, your hip joint. But it's basically just a big funnel because all those collecting ducts are dumping urine into here. And then from here, it's going to drain into this tube, which is what? The urine. That's the way urine gets made. So let me backtrack and look at a couple of slides. Don't try to write all this down. You can get the PowerPoint. We said over and over again, the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. It's the filter. It's the structures that filter out your blood. There's about 1 million of them in the cortex of each kidney. Now, if you were in class yesterday, we're talking about cortex. In an organ, in a gland or an organ, where's the cortex? It's the outside part. What is the inside part called? The medulla. Okay? Same with the adrenal gland and kidney. Cortex is the outside layer. Medulla is the inside layer. So step number 1 of making urine is filtration. Step number 1, filtration. The glomerulus is the filter. That's that capillary bed. It's located inside Bowman's capsule, or the glomerular capsule. It's semi-permeable, which means some things can get out, some things can't. Okay? Things like water, waste like urea, glucose.
Miss Fanning, you have a phone call, line 1. Miss Fanning, line 1.
Amino acids. All these things down here get pushed out of the blood into that capsule, that renal, the Bowman's capsule. Most of these things, do you want to urinate most of these things out? No, okay? Anything less than 60 Daltons gets filtered out. Now, anybody ever heard of a unit called a Dalton? Anybody know what it is? In the periodic table, what unit are those red numbers in at the bottom of each element? What's the unit of measure in the periodic table? AMUs, right? Atomic mass units. Okay, you've all heard that before, right? AMUs? That's a Dalton. It's another name for it. A Dalton is an AMU. Same thing. 1 AMU is really small. It's about the size of 1 what? 1 AMU is about the size of 1 proton. But 60,000 of them is quite a bit, right? But so what we're saying here is small things get filtered out of the blood. Big things like a red blood cell, they don't. That's step number 1, filtration. Step 2 is tubular reabsorption. And this is when we want to get things out of that tube that we want to keep and put those back to where? Back to the blood. It happens mostly, like we said, in the first part of the renal tubule, the proximal convoluted tubule, and also in that loop of Henle. About 75% of the water that got filtered out moves back into the blood, mostly by osmosis. Glucose and other minerals like sodium and potassium, sugars, amino acids, those get put back into the blood by active transport. Now notice I've got a word up here, adaptations, kangaroo rat. Anybody know what a kangaroo rat is? Little bitty rat lives where? In the desert. It almost never drinks because there's not much for it to drink. What do you think about its kidneys that might be adapted to help it deal with that? This, let's go back to the picture here for a minute. This loop of Henle in a kangaroo rat is really, really, really long. Okay? Really long. Which means there's a lot more time and a lot more space for what to happen. A lot more time and a lot more space for reabsorption of what to happen? Water. So when the kangaroo rat urinates, it comes out sort of what? Sort of pasty. Okay? Very little what in its urine? Very little water. Okay? Keeps most of its water in its body. Tubular reabsorption. And this, the last one that we were mentioning next, was tubular secretion. The filtrate, the stuff that got filtered out of the blood, now makes it to the last part of that tube, the distal convoluted tubule. There may still be some things in the blood vessels that our body needs to get rid of. And we said things like H+. In the distal part of the tube, some things will get pumped, actively transported from the blood into the last part of the tube, the distal convoluted tubule, and those will go out as urine. That's one of the main ways your body helps to regulate its blood pH. If there's too many H+, pump them out. Okay, pump them out. If you pump out H pluses, what happens to the pH of your blood? If you get rid of H pluses, what happens to pH? It goes up. Okay, more H pluses means pH drops. Okay. All right, last thing. After all that's said and done, what's left in that tube is called urine. It's got some excess salts in it, some water, some waste, mostly urea. It will go into a series of collecting ducts, go into that renal pelvis, that area that looks like your hip joint, and eventually head into the ureter and to the bladder, and then hopefully out if everything works right. All right, last thing. This is the very last slide. Two important things to remember about the kidneys. They're about osmoregulation, homeostasis, keeping quiet, balance, water and salt concentrations, balance. That's their main job, controlling water and salt balance. If you eat really salty foods, you're going to urinate more or less. If you eat really salty foods, you're going to urinate less. Okay? If you drink lots of water and don't eat much, you're going to urinate more. Okay? To keep that balance correct. ADH, we talked about yesterday in class. In the videos, Monday talked about it. ADH is released by what gland in your brain? Probably going to be a test question tomorrow for some of you. The pituitary, okay, the posterior pituitary. And its job is when you're getting dehydrated, it's sending a message to the kidneys and saying, you better what? You better stop urinating out my water because I need it. I'm getting dehydrated. Slow down, okay? Keep water in. Make the urine more concentrated. That's a good place to stop.
Oh, it'll